Hello, welcome to this week's Soccer 101 lecture, and this week we're looking at class. So I'll be breaking this up into four parts: inequality and class, to kind of give some general thoughts on the topic. Then I'll be looking at Marx and Weber's work on class, Pierre Bourdieu's ideas about class, and then the last section will be on considering aspects of class today. So part one, inequality and class. So broadly speaking, class isn't a particular popular concept or topic really in Australian society and politics and the media in particular. It kind of cuts against the grain of the kind of myths that we have about the country as being egalitarian, being the country of a fair go. And it particularly challenges contemporary dominant ideas about meritocracy. That, if you're talented and you work hard, that, you were able to put all your kind of dreams into place or whatever. It particularly foregrounds Australia as a settler colonial society, and we imported much of the kind of class structure from Britain, although it is very different here as well, and that we have our own history of the way the class developed through institutions and land and ownership and things like that. But more broadly, really, there's even a reluctance to kind of talk about it in public. There's even a reluctance to kind of collect statistics about it. Like the ABS doesn't really use class as a concept. It tends to use things like postcodes and stuff like that that can be quite problematic when considering, geographical areas, say like Merewether, where there's, huge $1 million McMansions and also public housing. So it's rarely mentioned in our public discourse too much. And like, ironically, one of the times class is mentioned is we might hear the term class war that politicians often use, where there's ever any claims for kind of redistribution of wealth, for taxing the risk. There's this kind of discourse that arises that, like, we shouldn't really be, redistributing wealth like that. It's undeserving. There's a politics of envy going on in that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like when it's used in public, it's kind of turned on its head. So how is class used? It is used colloquially, but sometimes through other terms like, bogan, westie, chav, hipster, and these kind of things. They're kinds of ways of talking about class without talking about class, in a sense. People use use the term class to talk about classy things, and this tends to be kind of high status, good-looking, fashionable things, or high class being kind of snobby or pretentious. And as I mentioned, there's kind of sometimes mention of the class war and class systems and stuff like that in terms of envy and resentment. So that's kind of more colloquial uses, but like in terms of sociology, class is essentially a systematic way of thinking about how inequality works, functions, and who benefits from it. So there's numerous aspects of it. Certainly the material economic side is really important in terms of who has what in terms of wealth. And socioeconomic status is something that's measured through statistics like that. And there's also cultural and symbolic aspects of class that I'll talk about, particularly when I get into the section on Bourdieu. So class, it's also important to consider that class isn't just about disadvantage, although much research is about the disadvantaged. Class is also about how advantage and privilege works and functions in a society as well. So in terms of class, though, it's kind of this systematic way of analysing inequality and wealth distribution, and the cultural and symbolic things that stem from that. So what is wealth, for instance? So wealth refers to the total assets owned by an individual, minus any debts that they owe. So you can see here there's already a bit of a complexity with how wealth may work. I mean, really most Australians that say that own a house are probably, if you measure it like that, in negative wealth because they'll have a massive mortgage. But really, the house is worth a lot. They'd be able to sell it and probably make a lot more money than they had from the time they bought it. So it's a little bit more complex than just minusing debts from total assets because, those assets are actually worth something as well. This is particularly the case as income from wealth and assets kind of drives more wealth and more income. And our tax systems and many of the ways that our economy works tends to reward more the side of wealth than income. So in terms of things like taxes and trusts and stuff like that you can set up with your things that you own, and it's easier to kind of then make money out of that than in terms of the ways that things like, the income from your job is kind of taxed. So it's difficult to measure, and there's a kind of link to some stats there. And it's difficult to measure in multiple ways, particularly when it comes to the rich, who are, I'll get into in a minute, are very good at hiding their wealth. A kind of, an anecdote about what I'm kind of getting at here is that, throughout 2021, there were statistics showing that in Sydney that the average price of a house was raising $1,000 a week, which is actually more than, most people earn in their job. So in terms of owning a house, your wealth was increasing more, at that weekly rate than it would than many people earn in their job. So, the ownership of things here becomes quite important in terms of how wealth and inequality works. In terms of wealth, though, when it comes to the really wealthy, they're really good at hiding it. In fact, we don't really know how much wealth there is in the world because so much of it is hidden. So the quote there shows that, 17 years ago, it was estimated there was perhaps $11.5 trillion dollars worth of wealth, American dollars, held offshore. And that would equate to, what's about a quarter of the global wealth, or the entire GDP of the United States. So, it's quite an amazing stat when you think about it, that maybe a quarter of global wealth is held in offshore tax havens. So even, in terms of the stats I'm about to show you, the measurement of that immense wealth is actually difficult to define and quite distorted by what's hidden. And whenever this stuff is revealed, there's huge controversies, like the Panama Papers in particular, showing about all the dodgy practices that wealthy people were using to kind of hide their wealth and to avoid taxes. The other thing when it comes to wealth and inequality is that many people kind of underestimate just how high in the class system they are when it comes to earnings. And this is particularly the case with distortions around what people imagine or what is the average wage, average in inverted commas there. So this is, I think, a really good table here that kind of unpacks some of those things. And you can see here that, for adults, in terms of total income, the average is $52,000. But if you're earning $79,000, you're in the top 20% of total income. So, once you're getting up to the $100,000 level, you start moving into the top 10%. So I think many people, particularly middle class people, really underestimate just kind of, where they lie in terms of income distribution. And this, I think, has really important consequences for how people then think about inequality and poverty and who they blame and how they kind of consider those problems. So the other thing here is there's different kind of ways of measuring and compartmentalizing this stuff. So as taxpayers, workers, adults, households adjusted for size, and these, distort how we kind of relate to forms of inequality, I think, and particularly the way they're reported on. It becomes quite confusing when we're unsure about what the categories mean. So I think that's a kind of really useful cheat sheet to kind of think a little bit about maybe where you or your own family sit in that system. And again, this is kind of a good unpacking of what sometimes the average is an average. And this is particularly because the really high earners distort the average. So here the average full-time salary, note that's a different category again, would put a person actually in the top 25% of earners. So, you can have a look at that graph and understand that for yourself. In terms of distribution, and this is kind of in terms of US figures, Australia isn't as unequal as the US, but it's getting there. The graph there that's out of a really good book called The Broken Ladder shows, the distribution of wealth by, trying to get some kind of scale to think about it. Many people kind of see the distribution of wealth as kind of ending at the top of that curve there, but really if you want to graph it properly, it just keeps going and going and going in terms of just how much the top 0.1% own and have. So the ultra wealthy, has to end up being a kind of multi-story building in the book. So that only gets to the top 0.1%. If you wanted to keep going up, you'd have to have a kind of a multi-story building rather than a person to display the representation of that. Also, if you're interested in that, there's a website on that page there that goes to the L curve that has this little graph thing that you can move around and get a bit of an understanding of, the scale of inequality. So one of the things that, when it comes to inequality, that people think about too is that they think that many wealthy people are really generous and charitable, and it's just mostly simply not the case. There's a kind of idea that there's this kind of charitable capitalism where, all these rich, generally white men are kind of doing all these wonderful things. And again, as the table here shows, that in terms of the percentage of their wealth that they give away, it's fairly minute. So again, thinking about inequality here, we get lots of these stories in the media about like rich people doing all these good things or whatever, but in terms of the percentages of what they actually give away, it's very, very small. So one of the things that we kind of, myths of Australia is this kind of, we live in this meritocratic system of fair go. And, we've talked throughout the course about dominant norms, ideology, discourses. These are the kind of ideas that, dominate public discourse. Neoliberal capitalism emphasises kind of economic liberalisation, free trade, privatisation, competition. The production of wealth is prioritised rather than, say, the production of happiness or justice or, equality. And generally, proponents of this point of view argue that having inequality in a system is fair. They argue that it basically privileges those who try harder or work harder, privileges those who are innovative or entrepreneurial. They argue that having inequality in a system is an incentive because it kind of encourages people to kind of do more or whatever. And this, of course, ignores many of the detrimental effects of inequality. And also on a more global level, you often see that, rich global north countries have higher standards of living. But really that's based on very much a kind of zero-sum exploitative game between, the rich north and the way that the labour force and the products and things like coal or wheat or coltan or coffee or whatever are kind of exploited out of those countries. So in terms of the idea of fair go, the analysis that Class brings to the fore here kind of shows that there's kind of systematic inequalities that really challenge that very idea. So there's been some really influential work in particular in the UK around a book called The Spirit Level, and there's been a couple of new books from this research since this book came out about 15 years ago. That shows that kind of by thinking about inequality as being some kind of incentive in a society really ignores the actual costs of it, ignores power relations, ignores history. And this is particularly the case as inequality is rising to levels that we haven't seen since the 1800s. As the work of Wilkinson and Pickett show, countries or even states and regions with high levels of inequality have massively high social costs around health problems, crime, levels of happiness and satisfaction are always lower in higher unequal societies. So if you're interested in looking at that in a little bit more detail, there's a brief TED talk there given by Richard Wilkinson, one of the authors of those books, that kind of takes through aspects of that with some kind of, very obvious but I think very sad statistics that show how detrimental inequality is to societies. I'll leave this section of the lecture here and come back and talk about Marx and Weber.